I'm here to talk about reproductive justice, but I've prepared a presentation that intersects reproductive justice with the calling in work that I'm doing. Because I really do believe that one of the gravest threats facing us as a human rights movement is our tendency to turn on each other instead of to each other. And certainly I see this in the reproductive justice movement. I see it in all kinds of electoral politics. I see it in the climate justice movement. I see it everywhere. And so I'm prepared this blended presentation for you. One of the reasons that I do this work is because I believe how we do the work is as important as what work we focus on. And so the thing that I want people to first imagine and realize about reproductive justice is although it was created by Black women, it doesn't only apply to Black women. It is not an identity-based framework. It is actually quite universal. And when you try to say that it should only be applied to Black women, not only is that an essentialist analysis, but it also works on the assumption that Black women can't create universal theory, which of course pisses us off. Anyway, we're going to be talking about the reproductive justice framework, but the larger question is, we are sensitive to the despair of others and ourselves because the world seems very confusing right now, where we have much more division than collaboration happening, and the people who are supposedly being charged don't seem to be able to fix that problem. And so a lot of us are confused. One of the other things that I'm convinced of is that most people want to be part of something bigger than themselves. I mean, we're all dreadfully self-absorbed, but we're not finding a lot of happiness or satisfaction in that self-absorption. You know, because we yearn for connecting to others, and we are really important to understand that it's not enough to be correct. We have to do things the right way. We have to take the correct action. I am really tired of us acting like we're in a movement where everybody's wrong but us. You know, that whole assumption. And in our families, our loved ones are pulling in ways that don't even make sense to us anymore. I mean, does anybody have someone who's fallen into the Trump hole? Because I know I do. Have them in my family. And no matter how much logic and facts you present to them, it doesn't make a difference because they don't believe what they believe because it was logical. If they didn't get there by logic, logic is not going to pull them out. The other thing that's really important, that we are stronger when we're together, but we're not going to accept the status quo, where we are discriminated against because of skin color, sexual orientation, gender identity, class, or other, what I really call irrelevant categories. That doesn't mean they don't have meaning and they aren't important, but I'm saying they should not be used as a determinant of our humanity. And that we have more questions than answers, and mostly we believe in the power of joy transformation of ourselves and the world. So let's talk about why we need to talk about reproductive justice. In the 21st century, it's predicted that white people will become a minority amongst minorities in this country. And that's scaring a whole lot of people. Of course, I'm sure y'all have heard about the white replacement theory that Tucker Carlson and all of them are moaning about. Since they do have their briefs in a wad, it's really important for us to analyze what their options are, because you gotta have to know what your opponents are doing in order to counter program against them. They know that the one person, one vote system will not keep rich elite in power permanently. So they're trying to deconstruct the whole voting system and all of that. They also know that they are not getting replaced because white women aren't having enough babies. And I'm convinced that that's what's behind the restrictions on abortion and birth control and effective sex education. Somehow I cannot be convinced that they want more brown and black babies, and I don't care how much they mouth the words of civil rights and all that stuff. They don't want us to have more babies. They kill the ones we have. But their whole plan rests on compelling white women to have more babies, which is kind of bizarre because most white women I know don't see 18 kids and counting as a role model. Like hell to the no. And you're seeing all of these screeds talking about why women shouldn't go to college, women shouldn't be in the workforce, you should become a trad wife and just have babies and all this stuff. How well do y'all think that's working? Not at all. Except teen pregnancy rates went down over the last decade for every demographic except young religious ones. Their teen pregnancy rates are going up. So I guess in a way their plan is working because they are convincing ill-educated, impressionable, and highly religious girls to have more babies. And then another option they have may be to change the definition of who's declared as white. They've done that in the past. When Jews were not considered white, Italians were not considered white, Polish people weren't considered white, Middle Eastern people weren't considered white. So that's one way to expand your power base, is to expand the definition of who is considered white. I think what they're going to do is try to consider high-income Asians and high-income Latinos as white. So that's one way to do it. But we should also add a cautionary note. At best, they're going to be off-white. And the reason I say that is because when it's convenient to the white supremacists, they're going to kick them to the curb the same way that they provisionally allowed Jews to become white and still practice anti-Semitism going on today. So those are their plans, and we have to figure out how we're going to counter those plans. Also, climate change is going to reveal how porous our borders are, because 200 million people are expected to be displaced by climate change, and we can talk about shutting our borders down all we want to, but they're going to come here as immigrants or as terrorists. They're going to get here one way or another. And the question, which one they choose, may depend on how well we welcome them. I think that we'll have perpetual external and internal wars. We're in a war. Most of our wars are called our competition for resources in the global south. What we do is arm proxies to fight wars for us so that we can get those natural resources. That's what's going on in the Sudan right now. An argument can be made that that's going on in Gaza right now. An argument can be made that it's going on in Ukraine and a whole lot of other places. And of course, instead of meeting people's social and economic needs, we keep expanding our military. And I believe that white supremacists will demand an updated form of imperialism or apartheid, and all kinds of other policies to preserve white domination. Again, we see this attack on voting rights, on women's rights, on LGBT rights, on the mechanics of democracy, the attacks on the judiciary. I mean, where are they not attacking? Would be an easier question to answer. And there's a real risk that our scientific developments will allow this upgrading of our present-day social inequalities. Because right now, particularly, I've been doing a lot of work recently on a concept called reproductive futurism, and what I'm seeing is immoral billionaires hooking up with amoral scientists who are, in fact, talking about changing the entire human genome, creating what they call the gene-rich category of human beings, people who have been genetically enhanced, versus the naturals, which would be the rest of us, because we weren't born genetically, enhanced. And I saw one of them actually said a phrase that I can't forget. He says, if we are successful, the gene rich will have as much interest in having sex with the natural as present day humans want to have sex with the gorilla. They actually are working to bring that about, and they think it's all a positive thing. So we have to worry about the science. Now, I teach this stuff with a purpose, though. I am part of the global human rights movement. As a matter of fact, I'm part of the women's rights wing of the human rights movement, but I'm disabled, so I'm part of the disability rights wing of the human rights movement. I care about racial justice. I'm part of the civil rights. You get the point. I don't have enough space to put all the arrows on the page that's required, but whatever you focus on, you're part of the same human rights movement, believe it or not. And I'm going to explain to you the categories of human rights in a few minutes. But if you accept that you're part of a global human rights movement, then that means that I can't work on women's rights in a racist way without creating contradictions in my own movement. I can't work for trans rights in a misogynist way without creating contradictions in my own movement. I can't do civil rights in a homophobic way. So how we do the work is as important as the work that we do. So I teased y'all with talking about human rights. It turns out that the American public knows very little about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. When I ran the National Center for Human Rights Education, I commissioned a poll to find out how many people in the American public had heard of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Turns out that only 7% of the American public had heard of this document. And so, of course, I'm not going to let this audience leave without knowing what's in there. These are the current 8 categories of human rights to which we are all entitled. Civil rights, your right to be treated as an equal to anybody in society. Political rights, freedom of speech, the right to vote, though with Gore v. Bush, we learned we don't have the right to have our votes counted. Oops. Economic human rights, the right to have the economy managed in such a way that it meets the needs of people instead of the needs of Wall Street. Social human rights are those human rights that are born out of your human needs. And what do you need to live a life of dignity as a human being? Food might be convenient, shelter, clothing, education, health care. All of these are your human rights, yet we live in a country that likes to pretend these are just aspirations. We have no obligation to achieve those things for everybody, which is bullshit. Cultural human rights are the rights to practice the culture of your choice, to speak the language of your choice, to get the services you need in the language of your choice. But the cultural human right that I think most matters in the U.S. right now is freedom of religion. No one can force you to worship in a way that is not something you freely choose. But the women's movement needs to learn how to talk about freedom from religion as a human right. Because everyone who's trying to impose their religious doctrine on our bodies are human rights violators. And we need to name it as such. Environmental rights are those rights that come because you need clean water, you need air that's not poison, you need land that's not poison, you get to reject genetically modified foods if you don't want them. All of those are environmental human rights. Climate change, of course, being the most prominent one. Developmental human rights were the human rights that were demanded by what we used to call the third world, and then we call it the developing world, now we call it the global south. But while it was being called the developing world, they demanded the right to control their own natural resources and not have global north corporations use global north militaries to come over and take their natural resources. So probably developmental human rights is the driver of most of the wars that are taking place right now. So, because America is always having to explain how our oil keeps getting under other people's sand. We only topple regimes that have something we want. If they don't have anything we want, we don't topple them. It's really amazing how that happens. Anyway, sexual rights are those rights demanded by the women's movement. The right to determine if and when we'll have sex, if and when we'll have children. The right to sexual pleasure is a human right, which is kind of nice. I love, telling my partner, you ain't doing it right. You're a human rights violator. Kind of gets their attention. Anyway, these are the rights of bodily autonomy and bodily self-determination. And this sounded so attractive to the LGBT movement that they started calling themselves a sexual rights movement, which is fine, except that I have a problem with that. And the problem I have is that I don't want the queer rights movement to make the same mistake that black people make and only claim one category of rights, because we're only known for civil rights, not the full panoply of all the rights to which we are entitled. And there's a whole long story about how that happened. You have to read Eyes Off the Prize by Professor Carol Anderson to understand this tug of war between two men, W.B. Du Bois and Walter White, head of the NAACP, in the 1950s, when Du Bois wanted the NAACP to embrace the fullness of human rights, and Walter White only wanted to talk about civil rights because at the time, anybody who talked about human rights was red-baited and called a communist. And so he was very concerned that the civil rights movement would be called a communist movement. Actually, it didn't keep them from being called a communist movement. You might as well fight for what you believe in, because making decisions out of fear actually didn't work anyway, because J. Edgar Hoover and everybody else saw the civil rights movement as a communist movement. But nonetheless, we should know what our human rights are. I think that new categories of human rights are going to come about. I think that digital human rights is going to be the very next category that we need to teach about. Because right now, we're dealing with social media platforms that are taking over our lives. You ever shop for something online and all of a sudden, whatever you shop for just follows you everywhere you go on social media? I mean, give me a break. And don't even try to buy something like an intimate product. Oh my God, it's like, ow, I bought that once. I did not mean for it to become my brand, kind of thing. And scientific rights. I believe that there's something wrong when these insecure billionaires are building spaceships to escape the planet that they participating in making it so miserable. There's this whole movement that I would recommend that you pay attention to called effective altruism, and Elon Musk is a strong believer of it. Basically, it runs the theory that it is illogical for people with wealth and power to pay attention to today's problems, because their highest duty is to pay attention to what future generations will need. And of course, they plan on personally creating those future generations, which is why Elon Musk has 10 kids and counting or something like that. They actually are saying that enough of the right people will survive global calamities that it'll actually benefit the planet if there's fewer of us and if the us is us. Pretty scary stuff when you think about it. So having said that, reproductive justice is a human rights-based framework. And we would argue that reproductive violence is a human rights violation, because you can see by seeing the wholeness of the framework how important that is for securing reproductive justice. And we're talking about the components of it in a minute. You need a well-functioning public health system to even have a chance of achieving reproductive justice. So that's why reproductive justice activists offer such a strong critique of organizations, no matter how altruistic they represent themselves, who distribute birth control in the midst of a non-functioning public health system? Why aren't you spending that same energy correcting the lack of a public health system and stuff? Why are you actually ignoring the lack of a public health system when you're actually passing out contraceptives, some safe, some unsafe? I think that's the difference between people who support abortion and reproductive justice for purposes of women's empowerment versus those who support it for population control. There is a difference. It is wrong for people to talk about human rights being in generations, but because of Cold War politics, the United States took the position that the only human rights that really mattered were the first generation rights, civil and political. And then the Soviet Union took the opposite tack and said, oh no, the human rights that most matter are economic, social, and cultural. And then the third generation rights are called the collective rights. Like, I need to be protected from discrimination in the real estate market, even if I have Oprah's money. If I have her money and I'm not protected from discrimination, I'm still not going to be able to buy that house. Right, so that's the version of collective rights. So reproductive politics is really where our social problems are being played out and fought over. And, we're constantly dealing with laws and public policies that try to regulate pregnancy, abortion, birth control, but these policies do change over time. And most of these struggles are about people wanting to manage women's reproductive capacity, because it's always been part of a discussion about how to maintain men's control over women. And who has the power to make decisions, and how is this power contested? Is how you write women's history. Because there's this perception that because nobody made a good effort to record women's perspective, that women lacked agency. And that is not true at all. As long as women have been having unprotected sex with heterosexual men, they've been worried about their fertility, right? And these population issues are really serious because we're dealing with settler colonialist ambitions and labor needs. And so they have different strategies for managing the reproductive lives of different groups in our society, even to asking the question of who's perceived as a legitimate mother and why. And yet we've always resisted this, and why? We always have these laws. So that whole combination is called reproductive politics. Over time, you'll see that women's fertility has always been the focus because every empire needs bodies. And so whether you're timing it from the ancient Greek and Roman civilizations to modern times, you're still looking at attempts to control women's bodies. Like Emperor Augustus commanding elite Roman women to have babies. He literally wrote a law saying, y'all should have more babies. We had the Comstock Law, which of course Republicans are trying to revive, that calls it lewd and lascivious to spread information around birth control. The AMA led a campaign to ban abortion in the U.S., though they don't want you to talk about their history now. But basically, they didn't want competition for midwives. And I said, I don't have to repeat myself. But I am concerned about the euphemisms that's coming up now, because they're using things like population stabilization. Doesn't that sound neutral? So instead of saying population control, or even more offensive, population justice. Really, people? And so what we're dealing with is the constant criminalization of black women's bodies. I'm getting to the origin of reproductive justice, so this is why I'm taking y'all the long way around. Of course, during the enslavement, black women's fertility was prized because it produced wealth for the slaveholder. That's fundamental racialized capitalism. But right after the Civil War, the script flipped. Now all the babies we were having that were worth something now became worthless and a threat to the republic, as people would describe it. And so we had to do all these stereotypes of Mammy, Jezebel, Sapphire, etc. And we were called bad and unnatural mothers when we were parenting our own children, but we could be used to parent white kids. So there was always this contradiction here. And punishment of black women's reproduction is still going on with child welfare and foster care systems. And we also are dealing with the disposability of black women's bodies. I don't know if y'all are familiar with the case of Marissa Alexander, but she was a mother of 3 in Florida who had a restraining order against her ex-husband. He showed up 3 months after she had her last baby with him, tried to beat her. She grabbed a gun and fired it up into the ceiling to dissuade him from beating her. She was sentenced to 20 years in jail for attempted murder. This is the same stand your ground law that George Zimmerman used and got away with murdering Trayvon Martin. At what point do you just admit that laws are meant to benefit white people, not the rest of us? We fortunately launched a campaign to get Marissa released from jail, so she did not. I think she got released after 2 years in jail. Meanwhile, custody of her children went to that ex-husband. Talk about injustices, right? Anyway, we have to deal with contraceptives like Lark's are long-acting reversible contraceptives, and Depo-Provera, which often are targeted to black women because black women are not given their full range of options. Pregnancy Justice, which is the new name for National Advocates for Pregnant Women, monitor, investigate, and criticize pregnancy policing. Pregnancy policing is criminalizing pregnancy behaviors. Like if you don't follow a doctor's order, or you refuse an unnecessary C-section, or if you're found to be using drugs of some kind or something like that. Pregnancy Justice defends these women because there's so much pregnancy policing going on. Even to the point where a black woman had a miscarriage about 2 months ago, and they arrested her for, quote, an abortion. She didn't have an abortion, she had a miscarriage. And yet she got arrested for suspicion of abortion. And of course, we're dealing with discrimination against black children by the state and non-state actors. And like I said, there are no real strong legal remedies for black women to have. So I lay all of this out to say, well, why do we need reproductive justice? So we created the concept of reproductive justice in 1994 by centering ourselves in the lens when we were talking about reproductive politics and healthcare reform. And you can see from the photos, we're going from the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, even to the more recent iteration of Trust Black Women. We have been consistently fighting for bodily autonomy, self-determination, and agency, basically. So when we created reproductive justice in the summer of 1994, we defined it as a human rights-based framework, and these are its original 3 tenets: the right to have a child, the right not to have a child, and the right to parent her children. Let me explore those a little bit more. Because black women were always being subjected to strategies of population control and critiques about our children, like, blaming our children for the mortgage crisis, blaming our children for the deficiencies in education, blaming our children for crime, terrorism, right? We have to fight equally hard for the right to have children. And not only have children, but have them under the conditions under which we want to have them. So that means using a midwife or a doula, or having our birth plan disrespected. I mean, y'all saw what happened to Serena Williams, right? Experiencing medical racism after she had a baby. I mean, and it made us ask, if they won't believe Serena, who will they believe, kind of thing. But we also joined with the pro-choice movement in fighting for the right not to have a child. So of course, if you're into reproductive justice, you support abortion, birth control, evidence-based sex education, and abstinence if you can hold on. Abstinence is just a theory to me, because I don't abstain from nothing, but they say it works. And one of the things that we critiqued, the 12 black women who created reproductive justice, was that the pro-choice and the pro-life movement stopped once the baby is here. What happens once the baby is born? And so we should be able to parent our children in a safe and healthy environment. And that means without gun violence, without environmental problems, without unfair taxation so that certain schools get all the tax money and other schools don't get any. I mean, I think what makes reproductive justice so capacious and attractive is that it includes all avenues of human endeavors and stuff. So whether you're talking about the transportation system that bypasses the black community, or the way, voting rights are suppressed, is still a reproductive justice issue. So this was our framework in 1994. But a decade later, our sisters on Queer People of Color Caucus thought that the original framework was too womb-centric. It only focused on reproduction. And so they added a fourth tenet, that individuals have the human right to disassociate sex from reproduction, and healthy sexuality and pleasure are essential components to whole and full human life. In other words, this is a sexual rights statement that they made. A sexual rights gender identity statement. So right now, the framework has those four basic tenets, but I don't even know if it's fair or accurate to call them four, because every time a different group of people uses reproductive justice, they modify and adapt it like it's an open source code or something. So when Native American women use it, they talk about sovereignty. When immigrant women use it, they talk about immigrant rights. When incarcerated women use it, they talk about the rights of people who are incarcerated. So I like its flexibility and expandability and adaptability, and it's still reproductive justice. So having said that, reproductive justice is the application of the concept of intersectionality to reproductive politics to achieve human rights. And all big economic and social decisions are in fact population policies that seek to manage human capital. So we wanted reproductive justice to address reproductive oppression, to fight white supremacy, settler colonialism, and neoliberal capitalism. In other words, if you don't have in your frame the fighting of white supremacy, neoliberal capitalism, and settler colonialism, it ain't reproductive justice. And it's not just a label you can slap on something, because our content matters. To fight against a lower population, we need to use the human rights framework to overcome the limits of the U.S. Constitution, because the U.S. Constitution has no right to health care, no right to bodily autonomy. The things we need from reproductive justice simply are not in the slaveholder document, even though we try to amend it. I mean, we don't even have women in the Constitution because the Equal Rights Amendment has not yet been ratified. So we got a long way to go with the U.S. Constitution. We also want to counter all forms of militarism, poverty, and injustice, and build this 21st century dedicated to human rights rather than war and violence. I think there's a global alignment taking place, though, that I'm really pleased by all the justice frameworks. And justice, by definition, goes way beyond a simple request for equality. It says it's also about accountability. And so you look at it, reproductive justice, racial justice, economic, climate, food justice, health justice, housing justice, education justice, LGBT or queer justice, peace justice, all these things. It's almost as if the universe is aligning us all to march together in the same direction. And I'm really pleased with that. Because one thing I criticized South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission for, and that model that they presented for the world, was they missed the step of accountability. It ain't enough just to tell the truth. You need accountability for people to be healed. You know, just finding out that somebody murdered your child leaves you frustrated. And so I like that these accountability frameworks are coming together. Oops, I'm going too far again. There are standards when it comes to reproductive justice. By about 2006, 12 years after we created the framework, we needed a way to define what is reproductive justice and what is not. And so we created these standards. You have to use intersectionality. It has to use the human rights legal regime as its foundation. It has to center the vulnerable people in the lens, linking global issues to local issues, like the fact that you can go to Walmart and buy a $2 shirt that was made in a sweatshop overseas. You need to notice these things. Kind of, you know, that we link individuals to structures of inequality. In other words, if a person is pregnant in this country and is undocumented, that decreases their likelihood of reporting to the hospital for prenatal care. So they're making their decisions in the midst of these structures of inequality. And you can't be indifferent to that. It addresses the cultural stereotypes or assumptions we make about each other. It is necessary to build power to stop the human rights violations rather than to be afraid of power because it has been misused in the past. And it includes everyone. So these are the core reproductive justice standards.